Right, the next fun thing on our list, a Pragmatic War, Austrian succession from the No Peace Without Spain system. I've done the other two games in it. I have to say, one, I remember having kind of mixed feelings about them. They're up there. Hey, I've got a working zoom on this one. But I think they had more, they have to do with two things. One is the bubble map, the point-to-point map. It's not really bubbles in this, it's squares and fortresses, which maybe helps a little in all of them. But those are hard for me to digest. But more than that is the very static nature of the wars that were covered in those two. I'm not saying that I don't think the game should reflect that static nature. Certainly it should. It has more to do, I think, with maybe the bubble map, the point-to-points, dealing with that kind of static warfare. It felt, I don't know, not just the point-to-point, but a pulsing, almost CDG-styled game. These are interesting designs, and there's a lot to be said for them if you want kind of to go partway CDG. You've got the point-to-point map. You've got cards with numbers on them that are what you can kind of do each turn. And you've got separate event cards, so you kind of don't control the events the same way. Most of them are not things that you can hold and use. There are a few that are still dealt into there, but they're segmented into two different decks, and that's kind of like the solution the Clash of Monarchs has, which is to put certain important events or non-player controlled events into an event table in that case. In this case, they create a separate event deck and give you less, you don't have the choice between, do I want to play this for points or do I want to play the event? No, you're more limited, which I feel is appropriate in many, many cases. I'm always a little iffy about that CDG choice. They've kind of grown up. I know they did deluxe map for No Peace Without Spain. I thought the Grand Alliance or Bell Alliance or whatever war. No, the War of Spanish Succession. I don't remember. The 9 Years' War. I thought that one also had a paper map, but this one just came out with a real hard board. It came out with, well, I've thrown the counter sheets away, but these really slick counters that pop out almost perfectly. I had one that tore a little bit, but it didn't tear the bad way. So I was able to trim it, and it looks just perfectly fine. There were a couple of misprints, and they also did the right thing here. A couple of counters that, yeah, you could mark them up with a Sharpie and they'd probably look fine. One in particular was a little problematic. This guy needed an overlay on him. And then a bunch of extra stickers for, hey, why are we giving you all these blank counters? What the hell? There may not be enough control counters for the game. Screw it. We got room. Let's give you stickers for that. The other thing here, there's a map patch for the town of Breslau, or city of Breslau, which isn't a capital. Great, I can remember that. But there were a number of errors, so whatever. Some of these, though, are from for No Peace Without Spain. When they did the deluxe map, they made a slight change in the map, and so I've got patches for that, which I really ought to put into play before I forget about this thing. I had an issue with my order of this, where it didn't show up, and Compass was amazing about it. They just sent me another copy. I don't know if they forgot to send it, but it could have been a porch theft type thing, whatever. It's one of two issues that I've had with their games. The other one was a damaged box. And again, they sent me a replacement box for that, which was fantastic again. So, you know, they're stepping up the way GMT, for example, does. You know, these are also armored boxes like GMT boxes, which is kind of impressive too. Not, you know, who cares, right? You know, it's the game we're more excited about. But it does mean something when the companies are being more supportive of the work. If there is a misprint or something like that, they're backing that up. If there's an error in shipping or whatever, they're backing that up as well, which is, you know, better than it used to be back in the old days. So, what is this? This is the War of Austrian Succession, which I have scant games on. I'm trying to think. I have Maria kicking around somewhere. There it is. I think that's it there, right over the trash. Which, like Frederick, is this weird sort of... it's got a lot of weirdness in it. And I did that a little while ago. But I don't think I have anything else that covers the strategic level of the War of Austrian Succession. Now, you would think something like Freddy the Great, it would be easy enough to do, and there probably is a mod for it. I seem to remember there being an additional thing maybe came out in the General after Avalon Hill picked it up to cover the Austrian Succession. But I don't think I have anything else strategic for it. The only thing I have that comes close is Red Sash. I think I picked up Cockpit of Europe. You could put together a strategic game for that whole thing. But it is really an operational design. And so it would be a huge strategic game. It would also be difficult because the way the maps are constructed, they're kind of hard to cope with already and fairly large. I played Summer Scrolla. I did not try Cockpit yet. Oh no, I have Sport of Kings. No, Cockpit of Europe is, I think, the campaign rules for it, actually. Anyway, whatever. So what can we say about this? Well, okay, so the earlier games in the system have felt a little bit more static than I like for something that's got kind of this pulsed movement and everything. I just kept feeling like, oh, it's my turn. Oh, I do almost nothing. I don't like that feeling. I don't know. It just kind of gets to me in ways. And this might end up with that same sort of slow feeling. But one of the things that has me somewhat excited about it is that this is a more active war of maneuver. What does that mean for the system? Not a whole lot, a little bit. You're not going to see the same static fortified lines, and we'll see how that plays out in the rules. Other than that, some dice that I'm probably not going to use because they're fine dice. It's just they're larger than I like, and they're not even the really nice rounded, high impact dice that I feel especially guilty for not using. But I don't like playing with big dice. I end up knocking them all over the board. Little dice, you can knock around the board a little bit more. Let's look at what the board shows before we go into this. So one new thing in this is these army control boxes or whatever. They're just, the equivalent of wargaming syntactic sugar. They're just sitting there, a way of taking some counters off the map. I kind of don't really look too forward to using them. I am thinking I probably will not. You have your leader counters, which have two numbers on them. The first number is their tactical ability, And the second number below that is how many corps that they can command. Some of the leaders are royals, which is a new thing in this particular one, which is that you're starting to see the soldier king idea show up. I don't know how much it holds up. You do see it in the Napoleonic Wars a little bit, and then they kind of flushed that idea away. And I mean, obviously, in earlier periods, you had that, but not, I don't know, not all that common. The spaces on the board linked by point-to-point maneuvers. Now, you've got different stacking limitations on each space. In general, 8 counters can stack in a space. And I fucked up the stacking rolls last time I played, I think, and then caught myself in it. But if they've got a little wreath or something on them, they're a fertile region, they can hold up to 12 corps. And if they're mountainous, they can only hold 4. If you have a little number, the space is worth that many victory points. Now, fortresses don't all have a number on them, but they have a minimum victory point value of 1. Normal spaces, the squares, do not have, they have a minimum victory point of 0. All the combat counters are just corps, and they have a 1 on one side and a half on the other, except for the 3 that were misprinted. Anything else here? Leaders generally have a minor leader on the back of them. These are just minors. Oh, crap. Now I gotta look up to see. Did I screw something up? Well, I'm gonna need to pause the time, so I'm gonna do so right now. Set up right. Anything else we have? We have a lot of differentiation. A bar underneath shows you different nations that things are. There's some color coding for that. Not all of the nations start in the game. And some of them start in the game but are not fully in. You have a record track that tracks resource points, which you're going to be spending for bringing reinforcements in, provisioning navies in the case of the French. Can't think of anything else. You have victory points, which starts kind of in the middle, and the Austrians are aiming to get it up to here. The French are aiming to get it down to there. As you capture things, you get points for the locations you capture. You also get points for, it's not called famous victories anymore, it's major victories, and a few other things. Notably, what you don't get points for is when a nation switches control. Like if a nation just changes, leaves the war or enters the war or something like that, that does not generate additional victory points in general. There are some pre-programmed things that just come in at certain points. For example, Charles of Lorraine being declared Holy Roman Emperor. I've set up here on the turn track, I've set up the reinforcements that are coming in, but we've got, additional information there. All right, let's hit the rolls. I may skim them a little bit because we have done 2 games in the series, but this one does have some significant differences. Oh, where terrain changes, there's a little arrow. So for example, this is not going in the direction I would have expected. Okay, so greater is aiming where the mouth is open and less where the mouth is closed. So what's happening here is you're moving from an 8 stacking down to a 4 stacking. And that just, is a helpful reminder because pieces are on the map and everything, and sometimes it's kind of hard to see those terrain shifts. You got some special movement areas that are only available to the nation who is colored for them. Got one here. The purple is kind of hard to compare to the black. And those just let you know that only that country can use them. Movement point cost is 2 for those, if I recall correctly. You have some things to handle control of the different naval areas. WS. I don't know what the WSDRM is for. Oh, yeah, there's modifiers that come from the Hawk gives you one. There's another one that gives you another one that I don't see a counter for, so I'm not sure where that goes. But it helps the English get that. Okay. What else do we have? Capitals. Well, other than Breslau, which I don't want to put the damn thing on. I feel I feel like that's such a minor thing to try to fix, and I will have trouble lining it up. But most of them are in these capital letters, and that indicates that it's a national capital. This will be the primary supply source for that nation, and control is generally handled by the nation that's friendly to it. You'll have a marker if it's not. We'll talk about how control changes in a little bit. Yeah, we have the difference between fortified and unfortified. There are certain spaces which cause an automatic victory if they're conquered. I think I caught them all there. Amsterdam too. Yeah, where for the Bourbon player, that is Paris. If they lose Paris, they lose the game. For the Pragmatics Alliance, there's there's more options. Losing Vienna, London, or Amsterdam, any of those would be considered a complete loss. And that, I believe, well, we'll see when we get the victory thing. We have specific supply spaces, Prussian, Hanoverian. Okay, so the Spanish and Neapolitan home space is the capital and supply source for the Spanish. It cannot be used to place Spanish units raised from the force pool. Only Neapolitans can be placed there. There's something a little weird in the setup where the Neapolitans have a half-point unit in their force pool. I don't know what that means. Spanish units built from the force pool were built over at Girona, which serves as their capital for that. The Prussian, Hanoverian, and 2 Austrian home spaces are unlimited supply sources for their respective units and limited for all other powers. In addition, the Hanoverians is an unlimited source for British and Hessian units. There's no stacking limit in those special home spaces that are kind of off board, so don't worry about them. Okay. Sea zones. There's 2 sea zones in the map, the Med and the Channel. The Atlantic, which represents the Channel, basically. The Pragmatic player always controls the Atlantic and Mediterranean sea zones unless it's contested by the Bourbons. Control of the sea zone affects lines of communication, sea movement, and also it will impact victory points if they are contested. Ports. Ports are represented by the name being in the water, which is going to be hard to remember, but it reduces the busyness on the map. Ports can be used for sea moves and tracing line of communication over water to another port. Army boxes we don't care about. Talked a little bit about leaders. Okay. The color of the leader, their home nation, if they don't have a core of their home nation under their command, they lose a point off their tactical rating, down to 0. There are leaders who will get promoted through the reinforcement track. They're already on the board. So for example, Frederick here that I showed you starts out as just a minor leader. Frederick will eventually show up. Let's see. We already talked about stacking. Okay, how stacking is applied, and we gotta swap batteries. To get this right because I've screwed it up before. It's worded in a weird sort of way. But the basic idea is you can never voluntarily overstack. But you can end up in situations that are overstacked, either through retreats or by sieging a fortress where you have a garrison, by relieving the siege to a fortress you have a garrison in. If you end up overstacked, then the overstacking penalties come in place. And the first one is if you have more than half as many full core as, let's see, if the number of full strength core exceeds half of the stacking limit, then any full strength core in excess of this number must be reduced. You're also not allowed to reinforce or restore any units in an overstacked hex, which kind of makes sense. And if you do any kind of activation, hex space, if you do any kind of activation from an overstacked space, you cannot pull more than the stacking limit out of it. So you can't get some sort of temporary advantage out of this bad position. You can mix your forces. Leaders can command different nationalities without restriction, but if they don't have a home country core under their command, they get a penalty. You're allowed to move into spaces with enemy forces during a campaign action, at which point you have triggered battle conditions, and a battle may result from that if the other side doesn't leave. Also during a campaign action, the inactive player can try to intercept into a friendly space in which an active force has just entered. And you're allowed to have up to, you're allowed to stow one core as a garrison in fortresses. And that's something you get to decide as you're being attacked. There's no fog of war in the game. They give an option to handle it, but I don't want to play with that. Okay, the event and action cards. Okay, in the first turn of the game, there's not going to be any event phase. But after that, the events start rolling in. And the way they go is from 1742 to 44, each player draws one event card at the start of the turn. And then in 1745, they'll be drawing one, but on alternating years, each player gets to draw a second one. Action cards, you're going to be getting a handful of those at the beginning of each campaign phase, and that's going to be your capability to do stuff. We set up the game. Some of the cards don't come in until 1745. It's a little obscure about this. It says place these cards to the side until they're used and shuffle the event deck when they are added. I don't know if there are any discards, so we'll see. But that could be confusing, depending. Okay, how do you win the game? You can win by an automatic victory or endgame. During the campaign phase, the victory point total is increased whenever you gain control of a fortress space by siege, or you convert a non-fortress space. Now, converting spaces is kind of like in Washington's War. You spend, I think, a movement point, actually, to flip a space over to your control. You also get a victory point anytime you get a major victory. Anytime you have royals involved in a combat, that increases the stakes. If both sides have royals, it increases the stakes by 2. During winter quarter phase, if the Bourbons end up controlling either the Med or the Atlantic, they get victory points for that. There's a typo here as far as I can tell. Level 2 Fortress 2 victory points. The number is printed on the map. That would indicate that, like, let's find one. Munich, which has a 3 on it, is still 2 victory points. I don't think that's what they mean. And there's probably errata somewhere, but... okay. Special victory points. These happen at certain times in the game and just get added in. So if Francis of Lorraine is made the emperor, that's 5 points to the Pragmatics. The British coming out of the 45 is worth 2 victory points. Anytime Frederick leaves the war, this is a weird one. The victory point value, the space of a victory point space in Silesia that was freed of pragmatic control is awarded to the Bourbon faction. Normally when you leave, this doesn't happen. Like normally when a country leaves, there's no transfer of points, but the fact that Frederick is successful and leaves the war is important. That way you actually use him to do historical stuff. The entrance or switching sides of a power does not change the victory point total. Now, automatic victories, well, like I said, certain locations, now this is during the winter quarters phase, the end of a turn, owning Paris, for example, could be an automatic victory. Also, at the end of the winter quarters phase, if the victory point level is at one of its limits. Now, notice that there's more spaces beyond this. The Pragmatic can bank points. The Bourbon cannot. If they get it down to 0, they can't take it any further down, and that's a slight advantage, I guess, for the Pragmatics. Okay. Otherwise, you count the victory points at the end of the game that you've collected up, whatever the location is at, and the difference is at 20. If you have 20 or less victory points, it's a Bourbon victory. 21 or more, it's Pragmatic. Now, remember, there are some things start out swinging towards the Bourbon, but there are some pretty major victory points. There's 7 points that are baked into the game by the end of the game. So this is actually more like here, plus Frederick captures something, whatever victory points he gets. Okay. We have instructions for each of the specific powers and how they enter the game, etc. Bavaria and the Empire, they start off as Bourbon powers. When Bavaria has a named leader and combat units, well, they have them, the Empire does not have either of these. However, its spaces are friendly to the Bourbon unless, and the Empire's over here, unless they've been conquered by the Pragmatic. However, in 1743, during the event card phase and prior to the draw, the Pragmatic Alliance rolls a die to see if Charles Albert dies. If he dies, all Bavarian units and Charles Albert are removed from the game. The Empire and Bavarian spaces are now considered friendly to the Pragmatic Alliance for the remainder of the game, and the Pragmatic faction gets 5 victory points for getting the Empire. In addition, beginning in the turn of death, the resource points for the Pragmatic Alliance are increased by 1, and that of the Bourbons are decreased by 1 for the remainder of the game. After that, death will, if that death doesn't happen on the first turn that it can, there are other rolls for it. Yeah, so on 43, it's on a 1. On 44, it's 1 through 3. In 45, it is going to happen. When Charles Albert and the removal of all Bavarian pieces from the board, you change control of all non-Bourbon occupied spaces to pragmatic control. There's no adjustment of victory points for this. Charles Albert and the defection of the emperor. Okay. Hate it when I stain this kind of paper. It makes the paper seem even less useful. France isn't at war in the first part of the game. It's part of the Bourbon faction, but it has certain limitations. They cannot raise forces out of their force pool, and its forces cannot operate outside of France, the Empire of Bavaria, and the Austrian Empire, excluding Netherlands and the Milanese. Until it's formally at war. The forces of other powers may not enter France, either side, until it's formally at war. Don Philippe and any Spanish leader or corps originating in Spain, however, can enter France, but they can only enter Piedmont, Sardinia via Savoy until France is formally... Piedmont, Sardinia is here. I don't see the via Savoy part. I think something may be missing there. I don't know if they mean Toulon or something else. Via Savoy until France is formally at war, i.e. Spanish forces transiting through France cannot enter Piedmont, Sardinia versus Queno or Nice. Savoy. Ah, I gotta come in this way. Gotcha. I didn't see that there. Oh, I expected it to be the capital, I guess. Okay. France may not be formally at war until 1743 at the earliest. It's automatically formally at war in 1744. In 43, it enters on a 1 or 2. This is checked during the event phase. Once at war, all those restrictions are eliminated, and they become full belligerent. No victory points change hands. The Bourbons get an additional resource point each turn. And these are basically the resource points that they have per turn. 15, that'd be nice. Modena begins the game as a neutral and may not be entered by either side while neutral. At the start of 1742, it joins the Bourbons. Okay. So we'll be expecting to see those there. Genoa begins the game as neutral and may not be entered by the Pragmatic faction while neutral. The Bourbons may only enter Genoa before its formal entrance into the war and use it for line of communication. At the start of 1745 event card phase, Genoa joins the Alliance. Okay, well, that's a problem. They join the Bourbon faction. There is no the Alliance. Like, this is really disturbing. There is the Pragmatic Alliance. But the way this is worded is weird and was highly disturbing. Saxony begins the game friendly to the Bourbons. There are no actual Saxon forces deployed, though, while it's friendly to the Bourbons. Any Bourbon force besieging Prague prior to 1745 has a value of 1 extra corps to simulate Saxon participation. At the start of the 1745 event card phase, Saxony joins the Pragmatic faction and operates like any other power. Any Bourbon forces in Saxon spaces must retreat. I haven't talked about the player aid cards. I haven't really thought about them. Okay. Piedmont Sardinia begins the game as neutral, but they join the Pragmatic faction in 1742. Britain and the Dutch Republic. They're not formally at war until a number of years after hostilities break out. Until 1743, British and Dutch forces may not sea move, campaign, or transfer units. They may raise forces out of their force pool prior to entry into the war. Okay. The forces of other powers may not enter British or Dutch spaces until they're formally at war. At the start of 1743, the British and Dutch formally enter the war and operate like any other power, and that'll add +2 RPs for Britain and +1 for Holland. Hanover and Hesse Castle, they begin the game friendly to the Pragmatics, and their forces are fully operational and their use unrestricted. They may operate in the Empire, the Dutch Republic, Austrian territory, and of course each other's home spaces. Okay, 1741 special rule. And it's not noted here. There's a lot of these little rules, and I don't know how much they're going to screw me up. If Cologne is occupied by a French force of 3 corps, whose move is undertaken as the first action of the Bourbons' first action card, Hanoverian and Hessian units may not leave the Hanoverian spaces or castle until 1743. The situation remains in effect as long as this condition exists or until the beginning of the 1743 event card at the latest. Well, I don't really have anything to mark that. I'm going to put a white counter here to help remind me that there's something special going on there, and I'll try to remember that. Okay. There's no real reason for the French not to go move there. They already own it, or whatever, because they are the empire. They may raise forces out of their respective force pools prior to their entry in the war. It's an odd diplomatic situation representing the maritime powers and their initial lukewarm support for Austria and support for the pragmatic solution. As long as their direct interests remained unthreatened, neither country felt compelled to support Austria until politics dictated. I don't see anything about this yet. France prevented this somewhat by assuming a threatening... Okay, hold on. Since George II was Elector of Hanover, as well as the British monarch, he could use his Hanoverian forces and their Hessians in the empire with some freedom. France prevented this somewhat by assuming a threatening position in the Middle Rhine that checked the deployment of George's German auxiliaries. Okay. Prussia. Prussia begins the game as a Bourbon power, but may leave... And so here's what These are all fixed rules for the diplomacy that's going on here. And I understand, it's a war game, you know. The other option is to throw them into event cards and all kind of crap like that for this type of game. Personally, I feel like there should be some kind of diplomatic maneuvering going on that's not such fixed rules. Just my own taste. Okay. Prussia begins the game as a Bourbon power, and that would be especially interesting to have something that covered both this and the 7 Years' War, because it really is one package, with the French and English basically switching who they're backing, but it's really a struggle between two pairs of nations for the most part. You have Austria and Prussia who are struggling over... Well, you know, it's kind of weird because you have Bavaria and Austria initially and Prussia on their side. And there's no real reason why France is on one side or the other in this, but they stand on the anti-Austrian side at the beginning. And by the end of it, the British are on the anti-Austrian side and the French are pro-Austrian, you know, during the 7 Years' War. I want something that kind of captures that diplomatic situation, and have always been kind of curious about a game of that sort. I had hoped Grand Sequel and what is it? The recent one, Imperial Struggle. I had hoped these games would kind of capture that more. Maybe in a way, I mean, Grand Sequel certainly does, and there's also a Wallace game, Struggle of something or other. I don't know. But yeah, I just don't feel like there's something that really covers it in the sort of way that, like, I don't know, some of the Napoleonic games allow for the kind of diplomacy that feels right to me. So, for example, Empires in Arms has this kind of rich diplomatic structure, but it doesn't really use it because that's a two-sided struggle. This is kind of a weird, Britain and France are the main antagonists in this period, but there are associations. So if you have Austria on your side, Prussia is going to oppose you, you know, that kind of thing. Where do the Dutch sit? Well, pretty much, yeah. Wow. Okay, let me stop thinking. Back to Prussia. Back to the rules. Prussia begins the game as a Bourbon power, but may leave and re-enter the game based on the event card play. Basically, there's a Frederick leaves the war event card. It removes all Prussian leaders and forces from the map board, places them in the force pool. Any minor leaders exclusively stacked with Prussian forces go on the turn record track, where they appear the next turn as reinforcements. Any pragmatic forces in Prussia or Silesia are moved to their closest friendly space. And any pragmatic control markers are replaced with Bourbon control markers with no change in victory points. Anytime Frederick leaves the war, the value of a victory point space in Silesia that was freed of pragmatic control is awarded to the Bourbon faction. No force may enter Prussia or Silesia for the remainder of the game. Okay, unless allowed by a future event. Upon play of Frederick re-enters the war, place all Prussian leaders and corps in the force pool on any spaces in Prussia and Silesia within stacking limits. Friendly and enemy forces may now freely enter Prussia and Silesia, and those spaces are considered friendly to the Bourbon player, with no change in victory points. If Frederick leaves the war is played as an event after the Frederick re-enters the war event card, apply the Frederick leaves the war rules, and Prussia remains out of play for the remainder of the game. If Frederick leaves the war prior to Frederick re-enters the war, it's treated as we just described. Historically, Frederick did come back in and failed to do much of interest. Okay, let's look at our sequence of play. Let's take a little break first. Okay. The first thing that happens is the event card phase. And you skip it in 41. We have these automatic entries, and then each player draws their event card or cards later in the game. Then we hit reinforcement phase. The British determine how strong they're going to make their Mediterranean and Channel fleets. I think initially they have to make the Channel fleet 3 until they're in the war. If the Med fleet is 3, the strength of the Channel fleet is 2, and vice versa. Basically, they have two counters, and one has to be on 3, one has to be on 2. Okay. Until France enters the war, the Med fleet is always 2. These don't cost anything. Then you use resource points to build and restore corps, or for the Bourbon player, to commission the Toulon and Brest fleets, which we have here. I can buy them up to level 1 or 2 each at a cost in resource points, and I think it's 1 per point. You place any reinforcements that are due to come in, you put any promotions that are due to happen. You shuffle the action card deck if there's not enough for all the players. You deal out cards, I think it's 4 per player. Then you do the campaign phase. You figure out who the first player is, and that player plays a card and does a number of actions equal to the points on that card. And you can hold a big card till the end, or play one right off the bat, or whatever, whatever fits your strategy. We'll see how that ends up playing out. And when you play your card, you conduct action rounds with it, which is kind of like points off a CDG game. After the campaign phase is done, and that's the meat of the game, really, when you're moving around and doing stuff. Appeal to Hungarian nobles. Austria is able to roll on a specific turn to see if the nobles come in. And if they do, resource points are increased for them, and they'll get their grenzers and partisans and such not. The winter quarters phase, both sides have to withdraw from enemy territory. Markers are removed for the sieges, for the insurrection, major victories, demoralizations, the fleets. But the Bourbon get victory points if they control either of the seas. You check to see if the game ends, and you move the marker first. Now, the pragmatic player always goes first in each phase except the campaign phase, which is variable. And I think it's based on this little marker here. The pragmatics have to go first here, the Bourbons have to go first here. And I think it's to your advantage to go second. So initiative is a bad thing, but I'm not sure. You draw an event card if the card says hold until play. And it'll say that very clearly, like here. Then you're allowed to hold on to it. No limit to these. Any other card has to be played immediately on being drawn, regardless of who drew it. Unfortunately, there's no way to verify that, your opponent has a hold card. They could be cheating you, whether intentional or not. And all event cards are permanently removed from play, except for Frederick Leaves the War. All right. Some of the event cards are multi-turn, and there's spaces on the board to have them up there and remind you of their ongoing effects. Bourbon control of the Mediterranean and Atlantic. In addition to preventing the Alliance sea movement or lines of communication in the sea zone, and granting the Bourbon player sea movement and lines of communication, the Bourbon control of the Med and or Atlantic has the effect of causing a victory point, and it may allow the Bourbons to conquer London. The Atlantic and Med begin the game under pragmatic control. They remain that way unless the Bourbons successfully contest. The Bourbon player can take control of the Atlantic or Med only during a campaign phase as a result of a naval battle won by the Brest or Toulon fleet. The pragmatic player automatically regains control in the winter after losing a victory point. Okay. The British Western Squadron, there's a DRM affected by the formation of the British Western Squadron in 1746. And then that increases, So in 1746, there's +1 DRM for the Western, and in 1747, it goes up to +2, in addition to the DRM for the fleet itself. Now, I'm wondering, Hawk may be a card that goes in as well. I don't know what goes in these spaces. I don't have a marker that appears. I mean, maybe you just move the fleet up and there. I don't know. It seems a little confusing to me. Okay. Bourbon seaborne attacks on London. Too bad the rulebook's glossy, yeah. Any Bourbon sea move against London has the potential of a successful Bourbon occupation of London, thus triggering an automatic victory. As an exception to the standard rules governing the control of non-fortress spaces, if London is occupied by a Bourbon force at the end of any action round, that space is immediately converted to Bourbon control. Furthermore, if a Bourbon seaborne force attacks London while the 45 event is in effect, add 2 battle dice to any Bourbon combat roll. And that's because the English are up in Scotland fighting, and the home guard isn't available. Lines of communication. Okay. Lines of communication are important for automatic victory. You have to trace to the right place. For placing reinforcements and restoring core, and for conducting sieges. And before we go any further, I need to swap batteries. Okay. Line of control can be done by sea. You go from port to port. Friendly space under siege is a valid path for a line of communication, but it's considered threatened, which affects siege resolution. Now, we'll hit that later. Overstacked spaces don't affect the line of communication. Insurrectionists and Grezniers, they prevent the Bourbon from tracing line of communication through them. Now remember, that has to be the Hungarians that come in. A supply source is the capital of a friendly power not under enemy control. For placing reinforcements and restoring reduced core, you need a line of communication back to the capital of the core being placed. This is considered unlimited supply. Limited supply is if you can trace to any friendly capital. You won't be able to reinforce, but you can use it for other reasons. The Pragmatic faction first builds and restores core, then places reinforcements, then promotes, transfers leaders. Core can be placed in a home space of the core being placed with a line of communication to the capital, as long as stacking limits aren't exceeded. If there's nowhere you can put it, you can delay them. The British can place one reinforcement or newly built core in Amsterdam if the space is friendly controlled. Girona is a special semi-capital for the Spaniards. They can place their units there. And they're considered to be in supply. You use resource points to build new core or restore reduced core. In addition, the Bourbon can use them for their fleets. You get a certain amount per turn. That's recorded here. Probably don't end up moving them down as you use them. You probably just keep track of how many you're getting each turn with that marker. There's a force pool for each nation. And essentially all the units eventually go in it, but it's not always, there are units that don't start in it. That's how many core you can build. Again, there's a weird thing where the Neapolitans have half a unit in the force pool, which I don't know what that means. Core can be built or restored because there's no concept of a half unit. Like if this unit only had a half on it, it would make sense. Or this unit. But how do I differentiate between these two units if there's only a half in there? And I just don't know. I don't know what's intended by that. A core can only be built or restored on an unlimited supply. France can build up to 3 new core each turn. Britain and Austria 2. All other powers may build no more than 1 each turn. New core are selected from the force pool and placed in a home space. That'll cost 2 RPs, but you can put it at reduced strength for just 1. You can restore. France can restore up to 3 core each turn. All other powers up to 2. A reduced core costs 1 RP to increase. You have to be on an unlimited supply. Commissioning the 2 fleets. The Bourbon player can spend RPs, 1 RP for a 1 strength fleet, 2 for a 2 strength fleet. And they can choose to do that with all their fleets. We have changes to the number of RPs that can happen. So the Pragmatics can gain up to 8 RP, or can be up to 8 RPs total. The Bourbon can only be up to 6 max, and that is before the death of Charles Albert. Okay. Then each player gets 5 action cards. I was wrong. I thought it was 4. Unless there is an event that adds to their action cards. The early spring event card can cause a player to begin with an extra action card over his opponent. The first player depends on whether or not the players have the same number of action cards. If they have the same number, then each player selects one action card from his hand and places it face down on the table. Both cards are revealed, and the owner of the higher card goes first. In case of a tie, the player with the initiative for that turn determines who goes first. It's different than I thought. As the turn track indicates, the pragmatic player has the initiative at the beginning of the game. If one player has more action cards than the other player, though, that player must go first. Players alternate their action cards. You cannot pass. You must play a card. You don't have to do anything with it. The actions are 1 through 4 from each. You don't need to pre-designate them. You can finish an action and then decide what you're going to do next. Leaders in core can only participate in 1 action per round. This means if you restore a core, you can't then move it in that same round. So there's a number of different types of actions. Campaign action. A single force containing any number of leaders plus a number of core no greater than the combined CR, command rating, of up to 2 of the leaders can activate and move by land with up to 3 movement points or conduct a siege. The transfer action. 2 leaders, 2 core, or 1 of each, located in the same or different spaces, may move by land, also to the same or different spaces. Leaders have 6 movement points, while core may move up to 4. Leaders in core moving as part of a transfer action may never enter an enemy-controlled space or a space occupied by enemy core unless the space contains at least 1 unbesieged friendly core, i.e. you can't initiate a new battle or siege. Replacement action. You can only do this once per round per player. A single reduced core not under siege can be restored to full strength and rallied if demoralized, if it has a line of communication. This doesn't cost you any resource points, but it costs you 1 of your actions. The rally action, kind of similar. A leader can remove demoralization from himself and or a number of friendly core in his space equal to half of his CR. This counts as an action for the leader in the rallied core, but does not affect any other core in the space. The leaders can rally non-home core and may conduct the action even if the space is overstacked. If the space contains multiple leaders, only 1 can rally. C-move action. A single stack containing any number of leaders and up to 2 core can move by sea. The deploy fleet action. This allows the Bourbon player to try to deny control of the Mid-Atlantic. He sends the respective already commissioned fleet to the appropriate sea zone. When the fleet is deployed, each player rolls a die. The Pragmatic Alliance player adds 2 or 3 to his die roll based on the strength level of his fleet, plus the DRMs. So it could be, plus 5, maybe plus 6 if you've got Hawk in there, I guess. The Bourbon player adds the Toulon or Brest fleet's current strength to his die roll. The higher roll wins and has control of the sea zone. Regardless of the outcome, the deployed fleet is removed from the map for the remainder of the turn. The Brest fleet only cannot be deployed until France formally enters the war. Otherwise, the Bourbon can declare that they're deploying whatever. So, the Med fleet can be used against the Brits early. Insurrectionists and Grenzers. Once per campaign phase, the Pragmatic player can elect to place that marker on any unoccupied space in Silesia, Bavaria, and Austria. This can only be exercised after the Hungarians have been entered. It'll stay there for the remainder of the year and then go away during the winter phase. Okay. I need another break. Normally, movement costs 1 movement point to move along a black line. But the other colored lines, the purple, the orange, are greater distances. They cost 2. Forces can move during transfer or campaign action, but only a campaign action allows you to move into enemy-controlled or occupied spaces. Leader requirement to move force core. As long as you're doing a campaign action, core can only move or intercept when commanded and accompanied by a leader. You're allowed to drop stuff off, but you can't pick things up during an action. Stopping coordination is basically the idea there. A force may not enter an enemy-controlled space unless it's leaving a friendly-controlled space. Spaces marked with an insurrection and Grenzer's marker are not friendly-controlled unless there's a friendly unit in there. even if they're friendly controlled. A force must stop. You'd only put them in friendly controlled spaces, so, or no, you'd put them in enemy controlled spaces to prevent them from being enemy controlled. A force must stop moving when entering an enemy controlled fortified space. They lose all their remaining movement points, even if the enemy space is under siege by friendly units. A force that moves into an enemy controlled unfortified space doesn't lose their movement points. But they can't move to an adjacent space unless they've converted the space, or they can't move to an adjacent enemy-controlled space unless they've converted the space to friendly control. A battle might likely happen in such a space. Enemy-occupied spaces. Each time a force enters an enemy-occupied space, it must pause, and the inactive player gets a reaction. They either intercept with a force in an adjacent space, try to avoid the battle, or do nothing and just take the battle. And then you'll fight the battle, maintain your movement points, and continue on if you win the fight. Fighting a battle doesn't cost movement points. It doesn't necessarily end the action. If an active force has movement points remaining and wins a battle, or the enemy avoided, you can continue moving, convert control of the space, or both. You have to spend your movement points for that. As long as you have movement points to spend. If the space is an enemy-controlled fortress, you must end your action, and the fortress is now considered to be under siege. You may not conduct a siege the same round in which you did any other action, including movement. Remember, each corps and leader can only do one thing per action round, and a campaign is not a siege. If you lose a battle, you must retreat and you lose all your movement points. When a force enters a space containing only enemy leaders, the leader can either withdraw inside a fortress, retreat, or he's captured. Unfortified spaces cost 1 movement point to convert, as long as the enemy is not there. An unfortified space marked with the insurrectionists and grenzers cannot be converted. Okay, maybe you do want to put it in your own spaces. You can only conduct sea movement if you control the sea zone. In sea move actions, 1 or 2 corps and any number of leaders can move from a port to another port. A sea move expends all the moving units' movement points. If you move into an enemy-controlled port that's not already under siege, then you must have a leader you can move 1 leader and 1 corps. You must move 1 leader and 1 corps. Remember, you can move any number of leaders and up to 2 corps. Okay. Sea move procedure. Sea moves might not work. You roll a die. If you roll a 1, you have to take a hit on a corps, or you cancel the move. On a 2 through 6, you succeed automatically, or you're successful without any harm. You're allowed to land in an enemy-controlled port with a sea move, and then start a siege if you have a leader and a unit with it. There's no interception at sea. Okay, land interception. When an active force moves by land into an enemy-controlled space and the space does not already contain at least 1 corps friendly to the active side, an inactive, besieged, and undemoralized force in an adjacent space can attempt to intercept. A leader himself may attempt to intercept into a fortress space in order to hide in the fortress. That sounds dangerous, but it can help your chances of outlasting the siege. A force can only intercept an enemy force on a space if the space is controlled by the intercepting side and there's not already a corps friendly to the moving side in the space. Only undemoralized units and leaders can try to intercept. No leaders or corps may take part in an interception if they were part of a force which avoided battle or lost a battle during the current action. Siege and space conversion actions may not themselves be intercepted, but the movement into the space could be. Intercepting forces are not allowed to overstack. If you fail with a unit, with a stack, you can try with a different stack that would be eligible to do so. Once you succeed, though, you're done. Again, no coordination. The only coordination you're allowed is you may intercept with a force to reinforce a force that's being attacked. If you're besieging, you can attempt to intercept, but if you don't leave a corps behind, you might be giving up the siege. As soon as an enemy force enters a space subject to interception, the inactive player announces the attempt. They designate and they can use any number of leaders and a number of corps equal to the CR of 2 leaders. They roll a die and adds the best leader's tactical rating, which might be penalized, and have to get a 6 or more. If successful, the intercepting force is placed in the space with the moving force and the battle is fought. You may choose to avoid battle. Now, I don't think you can do this if you try to intercept to reinforce. The inactive player, it's not really clear, but you're only allowed one of these, right? There are 3 possible reactions and they take place. Oh no, it looks like you can try to do any. So you try to intercept. If you don't get any interceptions, you can try to avoid. Okay, gotcha. If the inactive force is in a friendly fortified space, you automatically succeed in your avoid battle. If you're not in a friendly fortified space, the defending player must roll a die, add the tactical rating of 1 leader present in the space. Only 1 die roll will be made for the space. You can't split up, and you need a 5 or higher. All leaders plus a number of corps equal to the combined CRs of 2 leaders in the space may avoid the battle by retreating to another space. Any corps unable to move due to CR limits has to remain in space. The space being retreated to cannot be enemy occupied. Only 1 space can be selected. The retreating force may not retreat to multiple spaces. All defending corps do not have to retreat. Some can stay behind, and in fact they may have to. If a force is attacked in a friendly controlled fortress space, then prior to the battle, the inactive force can withdraw 1 corps and any number of leaders into the fortress as a garrison. This can take place even if you intercepted into the space. However, only a single corps and or leaders may withdraw into the fortress. All other corps have to fight. You can withdraw into the fortress even if you don't have a leader present, but you can't do the withdrawal from the space. All right, the battle. The active player is going to be the attacker, no matter what happens, whoever intercepts whatever. The attacker is an active force containing at least 1 leader and 1 corps. Otherwise, they couldn't have moved into an enemy space. The maximum size of the attacking force is based on the leader's CRs, and space stacking limits. And that's just a function of the movement. You wouldn't be able to get there if you didn't do that. And as the attacker, you had to be able to move into that space. The defender includes all inactive corps and leaders in the space unless any leaders and up to a single corps have withdrawn inside the fortress prior to the battle, in which case the force in the fortress isn't in the battle. Each side totals the number of battle dice they'll roll. They get 1 die for each full strength corps and a half die for each reduced strength corps. Rounding up. A number of dice equal to the tactical rating of up to 2 of their friendly leaders is allowed to be added, but the leaders can't add more dice than the corps have provided. Demoralized leaders and corps have to be counted separately because their dice aren't going to work as well. Both sides then simultaneously roll the dice. Leader and corps that are not demoralized hit on 5s and 6s. Demoralized leader and corps only hit on a 6. All right, each hit successful. And this is some of the weirdness about this system. And I don't know how well this is going to translate into the Austrian Succession War. Battles still did not tend to be overwhelming, like just destruction of the enemy force. So it may still work okay. But it is a little complex and a little more cumbersome than a straight buckets of dice system. Each hit reduces a full strength enemy corps or eliminates a reduced strength corps, and they're applied in descending order. No corps can be eliminated until all corps are reduced. The first full strength corps to take a hit must come from the power with the most corps present, and the first reduced strength corps to be eliminated must come from the power with the most corps present. However, no matter how many hits you rolled, a force cannot take more hits than the number of core it has in battle. So if you go in there at full strength, you're guaranteed to have half-strength core left, as many as you had full-strength core. After the battle's resolved, you roll 2 dice to see if any of your named leaders are killed or captured in battle. If you roll a 12, the leader's flipped over to its replacement side for the remainder of the game, which is probably an unnamed leader. If you lost the battle and you roll an 11, you might be captured. Captured means you're either dead, and the same thing happens as before, or you have to pay a number of victory points equal to that leader's tactical rating, not modified by any. That can indicate a few different things. It might not actually be captured. It may indicate that that leader is no longer politically suitable. They just lost this major battle, and you're going to have to, pay to maintain their command. Or it may indicate that they're captured, or whatever. Okay. If only one side has core remaining in the space after the battle losses have been removed, that side wins. Otherwise, if neither side has core remaining, the defender retains control of the space. Otherwise, whoever inflicted the most hit, the side which rolls the most hits, wins the battle. If tied, the defender wins. Okay? Not inflicts, rolls the most hits. If the losing side took at least one hit, all leaders in core in the defeated force are demoralized. There is no further effect of previously demoralized leaders in core. There's markers for this. And they hit worse. You can get rid of their demoralization through replacement and rally actions. They also go away at the end of the year. All core and leader of the losing side have to retreat, and all to the same space. Now, the attacker has a couple of choices to retreat. He can retreat by sea if he's in a port space and has only 2 core and any number of leaders. This requires a regular sea move roll, and on a 1 you have to take the hit, and that hit does not contribute to major victory. Any core or leaders not retreating by sea, so this is weird. All core and leaders must retreat and all to the same space. But then here, any core or leaders not retreating by sea, I think you may be allowed to retreat by sea in addition to the normal retreat. Must retreat to an adjacent friendly controlled space that is not enemy occupied, even if this causes an overstack. You do not have to retreat to the space you entered the battle from, but you cannot retreat to a space where you were intercepted from. So there's a lot of stuff you have to kind of keep track of in the battles. They're kind of cumbersome for a buckets of dice system. Luckily, it's only 1 roll. Okay, for the defender. The defender can withdraw into the fortress if there's room, i.e. there's not already a core in there. They can only send 1 core into there. They can retreat by sea. If they're in a port space and the adjacent sea zone is friendly controlled up to core, they have to make the sea die roll, and same rolls. They can retreat into a friendly adjacent controlled space that is not enemy occupied, even if this is going to cause an overstack, and immediately gets in. Any losses to full strength core immediately happen due to that overstack. Finally, if no other option exists, the defending force may retreat through one enemy occupied and enemy controlled space to reach a friendly controlled space. Even if this causes an overstack, if more than one space qualifies, the retreating player can choose the destination but must shorten the distance to the nearest friendly supply source. Core retreating through enemy-controlled fortress spaces and/or enemy-occupied spaces are fired at. Normal battle dice from core and leaders are rolled, plus an extra die from the fortress, and all these dice have a +1 DRM. These hits are assigned as per battle, and they're added to the hits from the battle in determining attack or major victory. The retreating units, leaders do not take a second leader casualty check. I believe in this case, it's a separate set of hits which means you could have been all reduced to half-strength core, and now you're retreating, and had you taken these hits during the battle, they wouldn't count, but now they can. Anyway, it is legal to overstack from a retreat, but there are penalties. If you can't retreat at all, you're eliminated and go back to the force pool, with all the hits counting for major victory purposes. Named leaders unable to retreat are captured and must be eliminated or paid for. A major victory happens if the losing side suffered at least 5 actual hits in battle, not just die roll, but they actually took those losses, including the retreat losses, or removed at least 2 full core from the map, or 2 core from the map. The winner places a major victory marker in the battle space. Only one major victory marker can be in a space at one time, and the most recent victory takes precedence. The major victory is going to be a +2 die roll modifier to the siege rolls against enemy fortresses in or adjacent to the space containing the marker, and it adds a victory point to your side. The enemy's major victories do not hurt your siege rolls, though. And these all go away at the end of the Winter Waters phase. In addition, if there's a royal, a crowned leader present, there's an extra victory point at risk for each side that has such a leader. We're going to pause again as we go on to the siege rolls. Okay, let's try to get through the rest of this. It's taking too long, but it's my way, isn't it? Yeah, I'm supposed to play cards or something tomorrow, so I don't know what is going to happen in terms of time. All right. A fortress is under siege and it's marked with like a control marker or with the core under it. Fortresses have their own strength. Most of them are 1s, some of them have a big 2 in them. Those are 2-strength fortresses. In addition to that strength, they also have a potential garrison strength added. Half a core adds 1 to their strength, a full core adds 2 to their strength. Garrisons that aren't under siege just kind of pop out and sit there. They can always fall back in. You're only allowed 1 garrison core or half core in a given thing. There's no sorties in this game. You can have leaders inside the fortress. They also help modify the siege value. So when you roll for the siege, the besieging player takes a siege action. He must have a leader who can command a number, or leaders, he must have at least 1 leader and a number of corps that the leaders can command equal to the full defensive value of the fortress, which is 1 or 2 for the fort to begin with, plus 1 or 2 for the garrison. He rolls a die on the siege table. Hey, we actually need this here. And that'll give hits to the attacker and the defender. Now, there are modifiers to this die roll. The besieger having their communications line impacts it. They only have a threatened communications line, i.e. they're going through their own sieged fortress to get to their communications, they get a -1. If it's a port that has a sea line of communication that you're sieging, that's 1 point off you. If there's a leader in the fortress, that subtracts 1 off you. However, a decent leader being used for the siege with a friendly home core and a friendly major victory marker add bonuses. And then each turn that your siege fails, well, the first 2 turns that your siege fails, you get these continued siege markers, which add 1 or 2 to the siege die roll. Now remember, you can only siege something once per action card, so there's a limit to how many you're going to have. 5. we found out, in general. Okay, the hits. So the defender hits, the attacker hits are just taken on the core that are sieging. The defender hits are taken first on the fortress strength, and there's markers to reduce the fortress strength to 1 or 0. There's a fortress that goes up to 2. Genoa starts off as a level 1 fortress. There's a level 2 fortress for it that it can get increased to. I assume through a card, because it's not in the entry. And it wouldn't make sense if it was in the entry. Okay. If a fortress without a garrison is reduced to strength 0, it surrenders. The garrison, though, keeps the fortress from surrendering. Once it's hit, once it's at a half core level and it takes a hit, it surrenders and is given honors of war. And the rules for honors of war allow it to, let's see what the rules are on this. It's immediately placed by the defender at reduced strength in the nearest friendly unbesieged space within stacking limits. Regardless of LOC or path, the owning player chooses if more than one space is eligible. Sometimes, however, the siege will begin with a reduced strength core. This doesn't matter. They're just reiterating. You're also allowed to retreat by sea, if I recall correctly, doing this. If the fortress is a port adjacent to a friendly sea zone, the garrison may be transferred to an eligible port space. It doesn't tell whether they have to do the sea transfer die roll. I don't know either way. The leaders in a captured fortress, if they're named leaders, they're captured as per battle, and you got to either buy them off or lose them. If they're unnamed leaders, they come back next turn. A siege is in effect as long as at least one core stays in that space. That may not be enough to actually do a siege action. Remember, you need leaders, plus you have to match the value and everything like that. Eventually, when you have to go back to winter quarters, if the siege is still continuing, you go away. Okay, Hungarian appeal. During Hungarian appeal in 1741, the pragmatic player rolls a die. On a 1 through 4, they succeed. Otherwise, it goes into effect the next year. And this is going to give them additional RPs, reinforcements, additional Austrian supply source, and allows them the insurrectionists and Grenzers. Now, that phase is where it's after the campaign phase. So you have to suffer a full turn. What's all over here? There's just all kinds of stuff here. I'm going to have to get used to that because that's going to be helpful. But I will probably be pawing through the rules because I'm more used to reading the rules at this point. 2 Austrian corps go into the pragmatic force pool. In addition, the turn following a successful appeal, the pragmatic alliance gets 2 RPs per turn for the remainder of the game. And they get 2 corps in the next reinforcement phase. They also get an additional Austrian supply source. The east space becomes a supply source. If the Bourbon player controls Vienna, though, yes, it's still a supply source over there, but that won't stop the game from being lost. The insurrectionists and Grenzers, you're allowed to place them as an action. Any space in Austria, with the exception of the Netherlands and the Milanese, Silesia and Bavaria that are not occupied by a Bourbon unit. Once placed, it stays there for the rest of the year. It cannot be part of a Bourbon line of communication. It's an enemy-controlled space for the Bourbons, but no loss or gain of victory points. The Bourbon campaign movement in the space requires an extra movement point, and if a battle takes place in that space, the pragmatic player gets an extra battle die for the light units. Okay, winter quarters. After the campaigning is done, you go to the winter quarters phase, and All forces in enemy-controlled spaces must retreat. Retreats are conducted as per normal retreat rules, can result in overstacking. Corps that it cannot retreat are eliminated and return to the force pool, while leaders go to the turn track as reinforcements for the next turn. They don't get captured for that. All the major victory, continued siege, reduced fortress strength, insurrection, and Grenzers, demoralized Bourbon, Brest, and Toulon fleet markers, and Pragmatic Channel and Med fleet markers are taken off the board. But first, why they do this after, I don't know. You have to score the points for successful capture. 1748, the game might end. If the game turn is 1748, the length of the campaign phase, well, the game will end. The length of the campaign phase may vary based on a die roll by the Bourbon player at the beginning of their action round. Each Bourbon action round, the Bourbons roll a die, and if it's equal to or less than the round number, the campaign phase ends at the end of that campaign, at the end of that combined round. Both sides get to play one card. And then you go to the check for the end of the game. Okay, at the end of each winter phase, there's a possibility automatic victory conditions are met. Otherwise, if it's the last turn of the game, you check to see who won. And the turn marker moves forward if applicable. Okay, at the beginning of each turn, starting with the turn after France formally enters the war, they roll a die and they lose a particular leader for that turn. This is an optional roll. I'm going to play with it. It seems cool. If they don't have that leader, you don't have to worry about it. They get to keep their minor leader. That is that. What's left of the rule book? Well, the setup and an example of play. Some discussions of the differences with this design. Music to play. Some further information on the event cards. I may have to use these. I don't want to look at them because I want the events to be kind of surprising. Again, I've had mixed feelings about this design. In some ways, I'm like, well, with the previous incarnations of it. I believe it does a good job historically. Maybe it's the cumbersome nature of the systems in it. They are different systems from most of the games that look and act a little bit like this. And that kind of throws me a curveball. There's also sort of a static nature to it that fits the wars that it plays in, but somehow that static nature doesn't bother me in, say, the old 3W campaigns of Marlborough. I actually really liked that game. But when it comes to having to select a card and do things, I start to feel like I'm having a much more painful experience with like that pulsed movement and all that stuff. So I don't know. And I'm not sure because Campaigns of Marlborough, it's been a while since I played it. And although I know it impressed the shit out of me, and kind of these games have impressed me too, I'm not sure I enjoyed it that much. Like, there's a fun value to being able to do more maneuver. We're going to see if this opens up the maneuver a little bit more. It doesn't have those rigid lines. That's a big difference. You know, we're entering a period of warfare by mobility again, like it was prior to the wars of Louis XIV. So we shall see.